All right. Good evening, everybody. Here in Madison, New Jersey, from the Dorothy Young Center for the Arts at Drew University, and to you out there in television land. So welcome to the, what is it, October 2024 meeting. So let's, with further ado, as Barry suggested we say, let's get started with our introductory slides. So we want to thank our sponsors, and there's something new with our sponsors, which I'll get to in a minute. We'll talk about what's new. I'll introduce Scott, and then after he's done with his main presentation, then I'll come back and do the usual wrap up and some upcoming events and all that good stuff. So we have a new sponsor, and that is Payara, and you notice I'm wearing the appropriate shirt. And so yes, they just wanted to sponsor us, so we got that going last week. So we're very pleased to have them on board with us. Our silver sponsor is Azul. Our partner is DevNexus, and their conference is on March 4th through 6th next year in Atlanta. The call for paper is already closed, so everybody is going to wait with bated breath to see if their abstract was accepted or not. Our permitting sponsors are JetBrains. Those, they provide the IntelliJ IDEA licenses for us. And of course, the Eclipse Foundation and Jakarta EE provides video conferencing for all the Java user groups. Our memberships. We are guest members of the Microprofile Working Group and the Jakarta EE working group as well. We're also a member of the Jakarta EE ambassadors, and also the virtual jug. And those of you who may not know, who the heck are these Jakarta EE ambassadors? Well, our organization is part of that. We're an independent grassroots group of folks committed to moving Jakarta EE forward through our active community participation and advocacy. And we do a lot of that here. But myself and Barry, we've spoken at conferences about that. I do my writing at InfoQ, so we do a lot of that in the Java community. So if you want to learn more, there's a whole bunch of folks that are involved in this. You can go to the website down there and learn more about that. All right, so what's new? So as I mentioned at the last meeting, it was upcoming. It was a week before it was released, so JDK 23. There is a link here for their launch stream event. It was a good 3 hours of presentations with various folks from involved in OpenJDK. And so that was fun. I think you can still watch it after the fact. For JDK 24, which will probably come out, I think the proposed date is March 18th next year. There are already 4 JEPs that are, 2 of them are targeted and 2 are proposed to target, and they should be, there's usually a 1-week review, and they should be settled this week sometime to be formally targeted. Of course, I'll go back and I'll find out that there's a couple others were added there. But anyway, that's you're probably going to have about another 10 or 12 for JDK 24, but this is a good start. All right, the release schedule, that was proposed. Ramp down phase 1 is December, and this is December 5th. Phase 2 is January. Okay, I think that's a good idea. Thank you, Barry. So phase 2, January 16th. The initial release candidate in early February. The final release candidate on February 20th, and then the GA would be on March 18th. So look for that. All right, Jakarta EE11. The update on that is, as I mentioned a couple of times, the Technology Compatibility Kit, or TCK, has been in refactoring, and this is what's held up the GA release of Jakarta EE11. So the latest is that the refactoring for the core profile, which is about 7 or 8 of the specs, is complete. And so the steering committee will initiate the release process once one of the implementations passes the TCK for the core profile. and submits what they call a CCR, or a compatibility certification request. And I think Wildfly and Open Liberty are those two that are close to doing that. So I'll try to catch up on some of that. And then I mentioned this last month, but I think this is important, on nullability in Java. And I just learned that the Spring Framework already has plans for their version 7 in November of 2025. They want to include the J-specify specification there. So this is going to, I think, gain some more traction as we go along. And then these are the finalized specs in Jakarta EE11. I think I've had this slide here the last few months because they've been ready to go since like May timeframe. Right now, Jakarta EE11 is in the milestone 4 release, so you can experiment with the new features in all of these specs. All right, and I mentioned this before too, that random drawing application is on GitHub for you to download and experiment. And with that, enough of me. So I'll introduce Scott. So Scott couldn't be here in person today, so he's checking in remotely. So Scott has been a full stack developer for longer than the term full stack developer has been around. And in that time, MySQL was the only constant in his development stack. He is passionate about sharing what he has learned on his coding journey so others may learn from his mistakes. And I think, Scott, you are a MySQL developer advocate at Oracle. I think that's correct. Correct. So, so with that, I will turn it over to Scott. No more ado. Okay. I got to stop sharing. Here it is. All right, Scott. We'll give. Oh.
Okay, can you guys hear me? Hello? Can you guys give me some indication of whether you can hear me? Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming today. I apologize for not being able to be there in person. I had planned on it, but I had a scheduling change that came up at the last minute. So I'm speaking to you from lovely downtown Brooklyn, where I'm at a conference. Today, we're going to talk about using MySQL Document Store with Java. As I said, my name is Scott Stroz, and I'm a developer advocate for the MySQL team. Before we get started, this is my obligatory I love me slide. As I said, I'm a developer advocate for MySQL. I've been a full stack developer for a long, long time. I'm a diehard Giants fan. I'm an avid golfer. The data that I'm going to show is actually from a golf application that I wrote. I meant to take this part out because I can't give anything away because I'm not there. But typically, I do give some stuff out. So maybe next time I'm up in this area and I can talk to you guys about something, I'll bring 2 things to give away. And that cute little guy you see on the screen is my dog, Murphy. He is my best friend in the entire world. He spends pretty much all day, every day in the office with me. And he is fantastic at listening to me when I'm trying to work through a problem. And he is probably the most database adept dog you'd ever see. This is actually a picture of when he was a puppy, before he became the 112-pound monster that you see here. So what are we going to cover today? The first thing we're going to talk about is the difference between relational databases and NoSQL database. I'm going to give a very high overview initially of what is MySQL Document Store. Going to break down the anatomy of what makes up the document store collection. Then we're going to talk about how you access it and how you connect MySQL Document Store with Java. And I'm going to talk about, break down some of the stuff with the CRUD API in examples, and also use raw SQL to query our JSON documents. So real quick, there's pros and cons to both NoSQL and relational databases. Talking about NoSQL, there is a faster development time. It's easier to modify the schema if there is no schema, simply because you don't have to worry about having a DBA or somebody come in and change the data type or a column, and then have that propagate across your different systems. If you want a new property with a JSON database, you just add it, and it's there, and it will be there until you stop using it. And there's also, for most solutions, it's a very simple CRUD API. So all of the CRUD operations are limited to or abstracted away from the user through an API. The downfalls or the negatives of a NoSQL database is the data is unstructured, and it can be difficult to run queries for reporting or analytics. On the relational side, some of the pluses are data can be structured and organized nicely, and it's easier to run queries for reporting. Some of the downsides are you have potential slow development time, because if you're in a shop that's fairly large where you have a dedicated DBA, then sometimes it may take a while between you saying, hey, I need this particular column added to this particular table, and it actually gets added. And then if you're working on an application that winds up getting more and more complex and you have a lot more relationships between some of the data, the CRUD operations themselves can actually start getting more. So what is MySQL Document Store? It is a JSON document storage solution. It's actually built on top of MySQL. The JSON documents themselves are actually stored in a JSON data type column in a MySQL database table. It uses the InnoDB storage engine, which means it's fully ACID compliant, just like any other data you would be storing in a MySQL database. As I said, it uses the JSON data type, and there's an easy-to-use CRUD API that's available through the different connectors there. If you haven't used a NoSQL database in a while, the nomenclature can sometimes be a little bit confusing. In the NoSQL world, the schema is basically the same as, well, schema or database. It depends on which database you're using. That, some people don't know. They're like, what do you mean schema? I've never heard of it. Well, it's a database. And then there's a collection. The collection in a NoSQL database is akin to a table in a relational database. And then a document in a NoSQL database would be equivalent to a row in that table. Now, when you create a new collection in MySQL Document Store, by default, it's going to create 3 columns. The first one is _ID, which is a var binary 32 data type. The next one is doc, which is a JSON data type, and that's actually where the document gets stored, where the JSON gets stored. And then the third one is _JSON _schema, which is also a JSON type. And the purpose behind that particular column is to add validation for your JSON documents. Now, some people might say, why would you bother having to validate JSON? Because it's supposed to be unstructured and not supposed to matter. In some cases, it might matter. Like, you might need to validate that every document that gets inserted into the collection has a particular property, or that a particular property is a particular data. And if you add indexes to your data, which you can do to actually speed up your queries, it'll add indexes to this table as well. So when accessing MySQL Document Store, on the server side, it uses the X plugin, which has been installed by default since version 8.0. So if you're using a relatively new version of MySQL, you already have the X plugin available to you, and there's nothing you need to do on the server side to connect to it. It uses the X protocol through MySQL connectors. Now, we call them connectors. Almost every place in the world calls them SDKs. And there are connectors that are available for Node.js, C++, Python, PHP, .NET, MySQL Shell, and the one we're going to talk about tonight, Java. Now, all the functionality is the same across all the different connectors. Some of the syntax might be a little different, based on the language that you're using. For example, some of the examples I'm going to show on the Java side, the arguments that are passed are a little bit different in terms of the data type than it would be, say, on the Node side. So a little bit about the demo application that we're going to show. It was basically a very basic rudimentary demo of using a REST API. It uses Micronaut with Java. There's two different database connections, which I'll explain why I did that later on. Most of the demo uses the XDev API. There's one example that doesn't, and we'll get to that later. And the schema is like what you see on the side here. So as I said, I'm an avid golfer. For the last 15 years or so, I have been the manager of a golf league in the area where I live. And for it's about 14 years now, I have actually used a web application that I wrote to track information about the league. So it sets up scoring. It allows people to enter score data. Users can sign up. We can send emails through the website. And what you're seeing as an example here is some data I extracted from that database. Now, the data for scores is not stored as JSON. It's actually stored in relational tables, but I thought it'd be a good use or a good data set to use for some of the examples I'm doing. So the JSON data type will include stuff like the date, the score. There's a course object that has information about the golf course that the rounds played, the first name and last name of the golfer, their net score. And then there's an array called hole scores, which is the individual score for each hole the golfer played during that round. And it includes the hole number, the score they got, what the par is, and the relationship to par based on their score. So if you look at the first hole, the first score was a 5, it's a par 4, so the relation to par is 1. I do need to warn you guys, this code is not production ready. There isn't a whole lot of data validation that goes on. There's no security in terms of securing the endpoints. It's something just quick and dirty I put together to show how the parts move together. And I didn't really put a whole lot of thought into data validation because it's not really what this talks about. It's more talking about how you can actually take the data that you have and use it with MySQL Document Store. So the only thing I really want to talk about with the dependencies here is the fact that I'm using the SQL connector J 9.0.0. Actually, since I printed this slide up, I believe 9.0 may have been released, but I'm not 100% sure. You'll see it's using a lot of their dependencies are using stuff from Micronaut and Jackson and Jakarta. So I have a score service. I can't actually see the top of my slide because oh, there we go. So I broke this down. Now, keep in mind that this is, I understand that this is probably not the way that most job applications would be architected, but I didn't want to dive too much into the architecture. I just wanted to be able to show code pretty quickly and how you can use it. The score service is basically what's going to interact with our database. The score service takes information from the configuration object, such as the password, the host, the user, the port, the schema, and it builds a string to use, or it builds a JDBC string essentially to connect to the MySQL database. Now you'll see here in the under URL, it actually is MySQL X. Normally you would connect to MySQL. And the reason why we're doing the X is because that's the X protocol, which we need to use because we're demonstrating the document store, and you need to use the X protocol you need to use the X protocol to communicate with the document store. So we create the connection string, and we set some private variables to the schema name and the collection that are pulled in from the config. And then we create a map of options for the pooling. So in this particular example, we actually set a pooling so you can do multi-threaded operations. This is actually saying that we have a max size of 8 threads. The max idle timeout is 30,000. queue timeout is 10,000. Those are in milliseconds. And then lastly, we set the CLI private variable to the result of client factory.getClient, and we pass in the JDBC URL and the options, and that will actually create the factory for us. Oh, look at that. I forgot I did this. I'm sorry. It'd be a little bit easier to see that stuff. So now that we have our service set up, I'm going to talk about some of the endpoints that I created. The first endpoint I have is an endpoint where it's /list, and it's actually set to produce immediate type.application JSON. And it calls the list all method in the controller. It throws a JSON processing exception, and then it retrieves the scores from the score service from a method called sourceService.getAllScores. And then it returns an HTTP response with OK, and then it says get result scores. And what get result does is it actually configures the data so that it has a count of how many records are returned and then the actual score data themselves. And I did that so you can see in some of the examples how the length of data that's being returned is actually changing. So inside of get all scores, there's a few things we need to do for a lot of our requested documents. The first thing we need to do is we need to get the session. And once we have the session, then we need to get the schema. And in this particular case, the value we use for get schema is the value that's stored in the score service itself. And then once we get that, we need to get the collection. And again, that's a value that's stored as a private variable in the service itself. And then we need to call .find.execute on the collection. So you see item number 6 there. It's call.find.execute is actually calling .find on the collection, and then we need to execute. And we have an array list that we're going to be returning an array list called docs, and we actually have to clean the result up, and I'll explain why in a second. And we pass to the method clean results we pass in results.fetchAll. So it's getting all the results at once. There are some cases where you might want to do times you could fetch one or fetch next, and then we'll go and fetch each row at a time. In this particular case, we wanted all of it. As item 8 shows, the last thing you want to do before you return everything is you want to make sure you close the session. If you don't close the session, then the session can't be returned to the connection pool, and you could run into some issues down the road. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to return the docs variable. And for most of the examples I'm going to talk about tonight, getting the session, getting the schema, and getting the collection are happening in pretty much all of them. There is one that's not going to happen, and you'll see that. So the function or the method clean results I had to add because by default, the way the data is formatted coming back from MySQL, it doesn't look very pretty. So I added this method in here basically to take the data that comes from the MySQL and format it the way JSON is supposed to be formatted. And this is actually what it looks like when it comes back from MySQL. So you can see instead of adjusted score, instead of being a number in the JSON, it has an integer, then a big decimal. Under course, the city property is a string and it says Charlestown rather than just returning Charlestown. So while yes, this is valid JSON, this is not really the way people would use JSON in an application. So I wanted to clean it up so we return the correct results. So now I'm going to show you a demo. So I'm going to do the list all, and this is actually going to call the endpoint and run that method. And it's a lot of data, and you'll see why in a second. Oops. So you can actually see that there are 16,306 rounds of golf that are actually stored in my database, and actually right now stored in the document store. And it may seem like it took a while to return that, but something to keep in mind is the fact that one, this is running on my local machine, so it's not very, very beefy. And two, a lot of the delay before the information showed up had to do with rendering all that data rather than actually returning it. And just to give you guys an idea, you can see that this is relatively new data because this is actually from a round of golf that somebody played just about a month ago, or about 3 weeks ago. So you're probably never going to want to return 16,000 rows of data like that. So one of the options that we have with Document Store to help filter out or limit is you can actually use limit and offset very much the same way you would use them in the database. So the next endpoint I'm going to show, it actually has, it says list, and then there's a required argument or required parameter called limit, and then there's an optional parameter called offset. And we take both of those and we pass them to the get scores method, and we're passing it the limit value, and then if offset is null, we pass 0. If it's not null, we pass the offset value, and then we do the same thing where we call get results for the scores and return it. Now, in our score service, our get scores method has two arguments that are passed. One is an integer, or one is limit, and one is offset. And again, remember, if offset wasn't passed, it's going to wind up getting a 0. You see, we get the session, we get the schema, we get the collection again. And now when we call .find on the collection, we actually chain the methods and we do .limit and .offset. And then we pass the values of the limit and offset to each of them. So I often have time, or I often used to have a trouble understanding like what offset is. And in some places, offset is a little bit different. In MySQL, limit means we want to limit the result to X number of values. And offset means we want to offset X number of values before we start returning. So if you have an offset of 10, that means the 11th result in the result set is going to be returned first. And then it'll be whatever the limit is in terms of. And then we call clean results after doing result.fetch all, and we return the documents. And if we see here, I now have a call where I'm doing list and passing in 100. And when I send it, you'll see we're actually getting back 100 results now. And you'll see the ID is 1 and the date is from 2024. It's the same result set, the same initial result we saw in the last one. But if I add an offset to this of 2000 and send it, you'll see I'm still getting 1000. But now this is a match that was from 2016. So it's a very, easy way to do pagination is the best use for those two together. Excuse me. So what we're going to talk about now is how we can sort data and how we can return only data that we want. In this particular case, we're going to be looking for the best scores. So these will actually be the scores that were, it doesn't matter when it was, it's just whatever the best scores have been on the golf course in the database. And we're passing an optional property of limit. And I don't have an example here, but the default limit that we see down on this line here is actually, I think it's 50, it might be 20, I can't remember what I set it to. So if for some reason limit isn't passed, we're actually setting a limit that's a default. So again, in our get best scores, we're doing the session schema collection thing. But now when we call collection or the .find on the collection, first thing we're doing is we're calling the .fields method. And what this method does is this actually allows us to specify which data within the JSON object we actually want to return. Now, things are a little bit different in the Java side than they're on the Node side. In the Java side, when you're using fields, you actually have to iterate them where it's property name as property name. If you don't do that, you'll get an error. And you'll see what we're doing here is we're returning the fields of first name, last name, score, course, and then the date field, and we're actually aliasing that as the date played. And then we're sorting that by the score ascending and the date descending. What this means is if we have two golfers who have the same score, the one who had the score most recently would show up among the other ones. And then after that, we're doing dot limit as well. And then the example for this one, we do best scores, we limit it by 10. Oops. And you can actually see here, like we have the course, we have the date played, we have the first name, the last name, and we have the score. And yes, this person actually did shoot a 29 on the front nine of Locust Hill. And I know this because I was with him. And also, all of the names in this, except mine, have been altered. So the golfer who shot this, his first name is Christopher, but his last name is not. But everything you see where it says Scott Stroz, that's me. That's actually a score that I shot. I'm not too really proud. So right now, every example we've given is kind of like running a SQL query without awareness. And we're going to show an example of how we can actually use find with a condition. So basically what we're going to be doing now is we're actually going to be building a warehouse. And what I wanted to do here as an example is just show how many rounds or return the rounds that are under par, which means if it was a par 36, they have a 35. So in the get rounds under par method, we have the session schema collection thing. And now when we call .find, you'll see we actually have text inside, which is score is less than course.par. So this is actually saying that the score value in the JSON object, if it's less than the value of course.par, that's when we want to return it. So that's what we're doing as the where clause. That essentially becomes the where clause in our query. And then you'll see here, we're actually doing course.name as course. So instead of getting the entire course object, we're only getting the name property from that. And that's what we're returning as course. And we're also sorting it by date descending. So they'll be the most recent rounds under par. So if I go over to here and call this one, you'll see that in the years I've been doing, there's been 177 rounds under par. And the last one was on September 3rd by Terry Kolsch, and he shot a 35. And you'll see here that the course, instead of being an object, actually is just Locust Hill Golf Course back. As anybody who writes any type of application that accepts user data knows, you should never, ever, 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 ever trust data that users present to you. And we want to make sure that we do some type of binding with that data so that when it gets sent to the database, it's being treated as a type of value that it's supposed to be treated as. Or more to the point, that it's not being treated as a command. So in our .find this time, you'll see we do score equals score param, where score param is actually a parameter that's passed in from the URL and is passed into this method. And the way we do this is, like I said, we have score equals colon score param, and then we do .bind, where we do score param, and then is equal to the score that's passed in. Now, if you have multiple bindings in your .find method, you just keep adding .bind. So if we had another condition in the find that was using parameter binding, we would just add another bind after the first one. And then you'll see in the fields method, we're actually concatenating the golfer's first name and last name. And that concat method is actually a MySQL method. So instead of getting first name and last name separately for this particular endpoint, we're actually returning the first name and last name as the property golfer. So in your fields, you can actually use the result of a MySQL function as the data that's being returned. And then you'll see same thing we're doing. We're sorting the score and the date. So if we go over here and do get by score, you'll see I'm actually doing 44 is the value we're passing in. And we click send, you'll see there's been 1,061 rounds of golf that have been at 44. And the most recent ones were by Herb DiTullio. And look at that, Scott Stroz shot at 44, not a horrible score. But it was at the end of the season, and it was all for naught anyway because we didn't. So now I'm going to show you an example of using bind with the like operator in MySQL Document Store. We have an endpoint called getByGolfer where there's an optional parameter called last name. And if last name is not null, it gets passed in. And then if it is null, it gets passed in as an empty string gets passed in. And then the getByGolfer method, you'll see in .find now, we have lower last name like last name paren, and then we bind last name paren to last name dot lowercase plus a percent sign, and that's like we're using like a like search in MySQL. Now, something to notice here is in the find, we have to use lower because that is the MySQL function for getting the lowercase value of text. But in the bind, we're using last name dot lowercase because this is actually a Java value that we want to lowercase to get the lowercase value. And I added the ampersand or the percent sign in there so I don't have to type out long names to show results. And if we do getByGolfer, you'll see the first 4 letters are STORO, and this actually has all of my results. Yes, I've had 271 rounds in the league. I'm actually the only person in the league that's played every year it's existed. And it has the golfer name, date played. And if I wanted to show something else, say I wanted to look up Sharp, oh, there's nothing there. No. Why isn't this working? Well, I apologize. I was going to pull up other golfers, but I can't because I obfuscate the names. I don't know which names are actually in there and which names aren't. So I apologize for that. I usually put a couple of names. I specify a couple of names that I know that will be in there. And when I pulled in the data recently, I forgot to do that. So I apologize. At least you get to see how it works though with my name. The grouping data comes in really handy when you want to do some type of analysis. And what I did for this one is the endpoint is called get course scoring data. So this is going to be information about the course that we have. But remember, every score that we have has the course information and it has the score information. So we need to make sure that we group the information accordingly. In the get course scoring data, you'll see that the second field is actually, we're rounding the average score to 2 decimal places and returning it as AVG. Now, in the next 2 lines, this is a bug that is part of Document Store. I have reported it. They still haven't fixed it yet. But I have to actually do min and then cast the score value as unsigned for both of those. And because if you don't do that, it comes back as a string, which means that a score of 110 will actually show up as a better score than 50, because as a string, 110 comes before 50, but it doesn't numerically. And we also do count score, so it gives us the number of rounds. And then finally, the group by, we're actually grouping it by course.name. And if we look here at the scoring data, you'll see that there's 2 rows returned. The front 9, the average score is 46.34. On the back 9, the average score is 47.43, which actually tracks because the back 9 at Locust Hill Golf Course is actually harder than the front. The highest score is an 89 on the front, 83 in the back. Lowest score on the front is 29. Lowest score in the back is 31. And guess I know 89 for 9 holes or 83 for 9 holes does seem like an awful high score. And when I first started setting up these demos, I actually had to go back to verify there were no problems with the data and that it was actually a real score, and it was. And the odd thing is, the 89 and the 83 came from the same golfer 2 weeks apart. So one of the cool things, I think one of the features that kind of sets MySQL Document Store apart from other NoSQL solutions is the fact that we can actually drop down into raw SQL because the data is stored in a JSON column. We can use raw SQL to query that data using JSON functions that exist inside of MySQL. And I have an example here, and this is going back to where I set up 2 data sources. And the reason why I did that is because I wanted to show that the query that we use works not only through the XDev API, but through the other connection methods. We're not using the XDev API. We're just using SQL through Jakarta data. So you'll see here, as the item number 1 shows, that if the optional parameter of source is null, we actually call the score service get aggregate course score. And if there is a value for source, and it doesn't matter what it is, and this is part of the data validation that I didn't do, we call the score repository and get the course, and we call the score, we call the course summary on the score repository, and then we return both of those data, both of the data matters. So inside of get aggregate course score, and this is actually the inside of the document store, we break this down. You'll see the first thing we do is to get the session, but then we don't do anything else because all we need is the session. We need the session so we can actually run SQL against it. I just realized we could zoom in on these scores. So the first part of that big query is I'm setting up a common table expression. If you're not familiar with common table expressions, it's basically a way to set up a named result set from the data. And in cases like what I'm doing here, it allows me to pre-aggregate kind of some of the data that we need without having to run through another query or another query request. So we have with ag scores. So ag scores is actually the name of the CTE. And you'll see we do select dot dash greater than. And what that select is saying is that actually pulls data out of the JSON object. When you're dealing with JSON in MySQL and you see a $sign like that, that means that we're dealing with the root of the object. So here we have $.course.name is what we're actually extracting from each JSON document and storing it in the course result set. And then we're pulling the minimum score and the maximum score from each of those, and the whole number from the scores database. So remember, the collection was called scores, so that's actually the database table that is created and we're using here. Then we use a function called JSON table. And what JSON table does is it allows us to take the elements of an array in a JSON blob and treat it kind of like its own table in MySQL. So here we're saying that we want to use the JSON. We're going to call JSON table. We're going to use the dot column because again, that's the column where the JSON is scored or stored. And then we're going to use the whole scores property, and the bracket asterisk bracket says to use all of them. And then we define what columns we want. And the columns that we want are score, which is an integer. So we're actually specifying this is the column name, this is the data type, and then the path. Now here, the $sign does not represent the root of the JSON document. It represents the root of the element that we're iterating over at this particular point. So this is actually dealing with the score property of the object that's an element in the whole scores array. And then we have number, which is the, again, integer with the path to $.number. Again, that's the path to the number property in the object at that particular element in the array. And then we group them by course, and group them by number, order them by course, order them by number. And that is the end of the common table expression. And then for item number 7, you'll see that it says select JSON object, course name, comma, course. JSON object actually, it takes pairs of arguments, where the first argument is the property name that's going to be in the JSON object, and the second argument is the value that would be in the JSON object. And then we do best score and then sum min score from ag scores. Remember, ag scores is actually the name of the CT that we use. And then we do group by course. So something I probably should have mentioned before I started going over this code and going over this query, that the idea I had for this when I was working this demonstration of these demos was, I wonder if we took the lowest score that was ever shot on every hole, no matter who did it or when, what would be the best score? So what would be the lowest score? And that's kind of complex, and I've actually given this talk before when I've talked, and afterwards I'd have people who deal with Mongo, and they were like, I don't know how we would do that example in Mongo, because you don't have the ability to drop down and extract the data as precisely as you can. So then once we have our query, we actually now call session.SQL and pass in the string SQL, and then we do query.execute. And we clean up the results, close the session, and then return the results of that. And let me show you what that looks like. So if we do get aggregate course, get aggregate course score. I'm not going to do that one because we want to show them. So if I don't pass an option in here for source, what's going to happen is this is actually going to use the MySQL Document Store code. So when I click that, you'll actually see that 2 results are returned, and it shows the best score on the front 9 at Locust Hill was a 20 if you took the best scores ever shot on every hole, and the best score on the back 9 was also a 20. This means that in our golf league, during its existence, at least in the time that I've been tracking data in this database, every hole on the front 9 has been eagled except for 2 of them, and every hole on the back 9 has been eagled except for 2. Let me just go back and make sure that I don't have other examples. Okay, so in the repository, and again, this is using Jakarta data. So we have the score repository, it extends generic repository, and I use the @query annotation, where I basically use the same exact annotation that I did before, with the exception of the fact that I don't use JSON object in the main query, because this will actually return that as JSON anyway. And I have a DTO that I created that handles the data that's being returned, and it just returns, if you see the method here, course summary, returns course summary DTO. And let me just show you that. So if I take this particular endpoint and I add anything to the end of it, and you're going to see, you'll be able to tell, this was actually something that I was like, wow, this is pretty cool because I didn't expect this. When I click send now, you'll see that the properties are different. So before the score was on top, now it's on the bottom. And we return the same data. And this was kind of an example to show that you don't need to use Document Store to actually get data this way. You can just use a raw query like I did in that example. So that's pretty much all. Those are all the examples I'm going to show about retrieving data. Now I'm going to start talking about how we can update data and how we can add data and how we can delete data. So the endpoint for this example is /score, and that calls the add score method on our repository, and it accepts a JSON object named score. And then inside of our repository, we have the add score method. Again, we do the session schema and collection. We call collection.add, and we pass in the score that is passed in from our request, and then we call .execute. And there is some basic error handling here where if there's an error, it says success equals false. We close the session and then we return success. And what I'm going to do here is we go to add score. So here I'm adding a score. Note that I have a property here called _ID. If you don't provide a property named _ID in your JSON document, it will be created for you. The only reason why I do this here is because it's easier for me to show the demos when I already know what the ID is going to be for the inserted value. And here you'll see we're inserting a score of 101. It was played today, but it actually wasn't, but I just do that because I like people think the stuff's up to date. We added the course information, the first name and last name. Little interesting tidbit, if you're ever working in a database system and you come across a user named Skippy Dinglehopper, there's a better than fair chance I actually work in the database system. And then when we send this, you'll see we get success equals true. And if we want to verify that it's been added, we go back to the get golfer endpoint and we pass in Dinglehopper, and we can see that the score has been added, but there's something missing. And what's missing is the scores for each individual hole. And we're going to show how to do that by using the modify method. So we have an endpoint here called hole scores, and that again takes the JSON body in the score, or I'm sorry, it takes the body of the request and passes it into add hole scores, which is in the score service. And what we do here is we accept the string data, and we do JSON parser to parse that data into a JSON document. And then we actually have to go through some more hoops. We have to jump through some more hoops to create an actual array using JSON parser. We use we use the value that came from parsedoc to actually get the ID value, the _ID value, and then we get the session, the schema, and the collection. We do collection.modify, and we pass in _ID equals ID param, and the ID param is actually the value of the ID that we just got from the JSON. And then we have the method called set, and here we're doing set hole scores, and we're actually setting that to the value of the hole scores variable, which is the array that we created from the string that was passed in. And again, basic error handling. If there's anything ever went wrong during that, it throws an error. So here, if we do update score, you'll see that I'm using the ID. That's the same ID that I just used. And this has the individual whole score information. And when I send this, I get success equals true. And then if I go to verify the update, again, we're using the get by golfer endpoint with Dinglehopper being passed in. Oh, what happened? Oh no, that worked before. Well, I'm sorry. If this actually worked the way it was supposed to, we would see the whole score information for this particular round over here. Don't know why it did here. You see something. No, it's the same ID. I don't know why that didn't work. I swear this worked before when I tested it. I'm sorry about that. So next thing we want to do is we want to remove or we want to delete documents. I created a endpoint called remove score. where you have a parameter where you pass in the ID as part of the URL. I know it's not the best practice, but it was easier to code this way. And that actually calls remove score in the score service. And in the score service, again, we do our get our session schema and collection. And we call .remove, where we say underscore ID is equal to ID param. And then we bind the ID param to the ID that was passed in. Again, some basic error handling, and then we return the value to success. I'm afraid this isn't going to work. So we do remove score, and we have the ID of the JSON document that we just created. Now it's saying that success is true, and if this works, that means that Skippy Dinglehopper won't have anything, and he doesn't, so that worked. I don't know why the delete worked and the update didn't. I apologize for that. So to recap, we talked a little bit about NoSQL versus relational databases. We gave an overview of MySQL Document Store and how the database table and the database columns are actually set up. We talked about the X plugin and the X protocol on how you can connect. We added the Java connector and configuring the connection, showed how to use the CRUD API, and showed how you can leverage the power of SQL to use to run ad hoc queries. If anybody is interested, this is actually the URL to the Document Store documentation. The documentation we have for Document Store is actually pretty robust. It's pretty good. I actually learned quite a bit from using that documentation. I didn't really have to go to sources to try and figure stuff out. So I'll leave that there for just a couple seconds and let people scan the code. And here is the URL to the documentation for the Java connector in terms of, and it's, again, it's specific. The methods that are used in the document store are the same. It's just how the data is passed in tends to be a little bit different. Okay, if anybody has any questions or comments or concerns, feel free to email me at scottstroz@oracle.com. I can also be reached at LinkedIn at Scott-Stroz. And then I can be reached on Twitter. Zoid, I'm sorry, I'm not going to call it X. It's always going to be Twitter to me. If you have concerns or questions or criticisms about the code, please don't do that on Twitter. I'd rather you just reach out to me personally, because if it's out on the internet, then people are going to think I'm a bad developer, and then I'll hurt my feelings and I'll be upset. So one of the cool things that we can do as part of my team, the community team at MySQL, is we are actually able to offer vouchers for free My Certification exam or free MySQL training, MySQL training. And that is done through Oracle University. Now, normally, if I was in there, I would say, hey, come see me after the session, but I'm not there. If you want to come to Brooklyn to give me your email address, that's awesome. I appreciate the effort there. But if somebody there could collect email addresses of anybody who is interested in this credit for taking a MySQL certification exam or MySQL training, then if you could collect them and send them to me, I'll make sure they get to the right people at Oracle. What's going to happen is I actually send them to one of my colleagues who forwards it on to Oracle University. They actually take the email address and check to see if you have an Oracle account. If you do, they apply the credit. If they don't, they will create an account, that email address, and apply the credit. And that's an Oracle University account, which if you have an Oracle account, I believe they're tied together, but I'm not 100% sure. And this is going to be a shameless plug for me. Thursday night, we are doing a MySQL meetup in Manhattan. It's actually in the Chrysler building. And I'm going to be giving another presentation where I talk about how in Java, MySQL Enterprise and HeatWave MySQL, which is our cloud version of MySQL, how you can use JavaScript to create stored functions. It's a pretty neat concept. It uses BrowVM to convert the JavaScript into whatever the native, I think it's C. And the talk is going to show how you can do it and what are some of the advantages are. And one of the huge advantages for me is the fact that JavaScript has a very good way to sort array data, whereas something like that doesn't really exist in the SQL language. As a matter of fact, there really isn't an example of an array or a concept of an array in SQL. So being able to sort arrays or return values based off of data in arrays is something that you can do with that. And you can also access some global objects in JavaScript like INTL. I don't know how we're going to do this because only one person can talk at a time. But if anybody has any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Okay, Scott, nod if you can hear me. All right, here's what we're going to do. I've got a microphone here, and I'm going to ask anybody who has a question to let me know before they start talking, and I'll bring over the microphone. And then after they've asked their question, there will be a brief pause while I switch from our audio to your audio before you can answer, okay?
Okay.
Nod, yes, good, okay. And here we go. Questions. Hello, hello.
Hey, Scott. First of all, thank you for awesome presentation. I use MySQL, but I have not dabbled in the document store yet. I must admit I use MongoDB, but in any event, I have version. Oh, I didn't see that. So I have version 5.6.17 of MySQL on my laptop. I'm a little bit outdated. I should update it. Yeah, I should update at some point. But yeah, is it possible to install a document store on a version of MySQL that's that old?
Am I good now? I don't know if you guys can hear me or not. Actually, you can't. And there's two reasons why. One, Document Store wasn't introduced, and I think Document Store was introduced in maybe 5.7, or I might be confusing the JSON data type. I don't think the JSON data type is actually supported in 6. So you'd have to update to a version, I would say, 9 maybe, since 9.01 is out. And actually 9.1 should be out pretty soon. I'm almost certain that it will not with a version of 5.6.
Okay. Yeah. The other thing is my laptop's 11 years old, and I can't even upgrade Mac OS beyond Catalina. So I'm kind of stuck with some of those apps as well. But yeah.
Let's tell them how old you are. That's another issue.
I'd like to assert my Fifth Amendment privilege on that one. But in any event, yeah. No. Thanks for all that. So, okay. Any more questions? Oh, Mr. Mike, another Mike has a question. Mike will pass the mic.
And while you do that, I'll adjust the mics.
Too many mics. Anyway, this question might be totally out of bounds. I was interested in the new data type that came up, which was a vector. And I was wondering, I was kind of, okay, good. So I'm not totally off base, but I mean, I know that it's not what you were talking about here. So the latest versions of MySQL has a vector data type, but no way of searching. Is that true?
So actually, it's not entirely true. It's true for the community version. In community, we added the vector data type, but we didn't add any of the supporting functions to actually be able to use that data type. In the enterprise edition and the cloud version, those are there. Now, if you don't care about the open source part and you care more about the free part, I got good news for you. In the last month, we actually announced that the HeatWave MySQL, which is the MySQL is a service that we offer in Oracle Cloud. Now is part of the always free tier, so you can actually get an instance that's, if I remember correctly, it's 16 gigabytes of RAM, 1 eCPU, and 50 gigabytes of storage that you can use for free without having to pay anything. As a matter of fact, you may even need to provide a credit card to sign up for an always free account, and you'll be limited to or if you try to use resources beyond that, it'll be like, hey, you can't do that, we need a credit card. And the always free tier is based off of the HeatWave MySQL is based off of the Enterprise Edition. So all of the functionality that's available to you Enterprise Edition is also available to you in that always free tier of HeatWave MySQL, and that includes not only the vector data type, but the supporting functions to be able to actually retrieve the data. Or filter the data is probably a better way to say that.
Okay, I'm going to check and see if we have any other questions here. Anything? Yeah, hold on. Wait a minute. Wait. I got to get my old body over here to you.
What is a vector data type?
You'll tell us in about 3 seconds when I put your audio on.
So a vector data type is a special data type that's used when you're dealing with what's called embeddings or a vector store, which is what AI solutions tend to use. So for example, if you had let me back up here. For HeatWave, I said there was HeatWave MySQL. There's also HeatWave GenAI, which allows you to basically ingest information from your sources that you say. So if you have a collection of documents, you can throw that up into a storage bucket on OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, and tell HeatWave GenAI to go digest that information. And what it will do is it will go through each one of the documents and it will break it into different sections. And then each section is broken into a vector. And the size of the vector is determined by when the vector column type is created. And really what it comes down to is if I remember correctly, it's a hexadecimal value that represents the text that was in, or the data that was in the particular token that you're dealing with. And I think by default, it's 1,024 elements, but you can go up to, I've done it to at least 2,048 elements. So you basically have an array of hexadecimal data that can be up to 2,048 elements long. And when you use the vector functions, like one of them I know is vector distance. So you can say, here is data, or here is the vector information for some data I want to look for. Go look in this particular column and tell me when this certain distance is equal to X. Now, I don't know enough about GenAI or any of the vector stuff to know exactly what all that means. I just know that's what you would do, and that's kind of like how it works. I haven't had the opportunity yet to become as well versed in some of the vector stuff as I would like to. And part of that was because we didn't really have a way to do it through the community edition without installing Enterprise. But free tier, I can actually use that to learn a little bit. And I would love to see if I could maybe schedule another trip where I actually come and see you guys in person, and maybe I can talk about the vector stuff or the GenAI stuff with MySQL and how you can use that or how you can access that with John.
All right. Well, wait. Do we have any? No? Any? All right. Okay. We got the mic.
Okay. So yeah, Scott,
Scott, can you unshare your screen?
Okay, yeah, so the Eclipse J NoSQL project is the compatible implementation for Jakarta NoSQL. And the supported databases, it says here Oracle NoSQL database. But is that the same as MySQL Document Store, or is that a different product?
So that is actually a completely different product. If my memory serves me correctly, the Oracle NoSQL is actually based off of Oracle database and not MySQL.
Talk to Otavio Santana, we can get a Mongo. I'm sorry, not my. All right. It's a good thing. It's a good thing you're not here to slap me for those more. Yeah, no, so we can maybe get MySQL Document Store as a supported database on the NoSQL project. So, any other
That would be
questions?
awesome. And
Nobody? Okay, so yeah, Scott, so yeah, that would be great if we can arrange for you to, come back out to visit with us sometime next year. Just shoot me an email, let me know. And so with that, I'm going to.
I don't know if you guys can hear me. I just want to say thank you for having me, and I apologize for not being able to be there. And I definitely would love to come back and see you guys.
This comes out in the video. All right. Yeah, it'll be great to definitely have you come out and visit with us. And so with that, if there's no other questions, so first of all, let's thank Scott for his presentation. All right. So in wrapping up here, I get the usual stuff. First of all, upcoming events. Payara has a hackathon a couple of times a year. There was one earlier this year, and they asked me to serve as a judge. And believe me, it's not an easy thing to evaluate the 3 or 4 finalists and their projects. So, but this one is started last week on the 2nd, and it's going to run through November 6th. It's 3,000 pounds sterling for the winner, which is, I checked earlier, about $3,900. And then the runner up are 2,000 pound and 1,000 pound. So if you're interested in participating, the topic is generative AI on Jakarta EE. I know there is some work going on. It's possible that there will be a Jakarta AI spec, maybe as early as Jakarta EE 12. Now, keep in mind, 11's not out yet. Hopefully sometime in November or before the Jakarta 1 conference, which is on December 3rd. So it'd be kind of cool to actually celebrate that. So it'll probably be 2026, when 12 comes out. So I myself and a few others are on this future directions working group for future versions of Jakarta EE. So stay tuned for any updates on that. So, but yeah, so if you're interested in that, please go ahead and sign up. Also, the conference formerly known as EclipseCon, which is now Open Community Experience, I think they have it as OCX, is in Munich. I'm sorry, Mainz, not Munich, Germany. It's the end of the month, 22nd to the 24th. There's this IDP Con in New York on the 24th. I know somebody has a free ticket, was interested in going. It was offered to me, but I can't go. That is my anniversary. Kind of would not behoove me to attend a conference on my anniversary. So in any event, I forgot what IDP meant, but it's a code conference for that. There is a 50% discount if anybody else would like to attend. It's in New York, so not too far from here. There's a conference that I was made aware of a few weeks ago. It's generally free. They ask for donations or some kind of contribution. It's on Thursday, November 7th in Arlington, Virginia. Please take a look at that. They were looking for speakers at the time, and I don't know if they've filled the allotment of speakers for that yet. And then QCon San Francisco. These are the QCon series of conferences sponsored by InfoQ. So this is the week of November 18th And so you can take a look at that website. And as part of shameless promotion, I think you've seen this slide before. I was asked to present a workshop. After the 3 days of talks, there are 2 days of workshops. So I'm really looking forward to doing this. So thank you. So, I have to put it together still. So that's, but yeah, so what's the night before, right? Yeah. Don't say that so loud, it might happen. So, I'm also serving as a dedicated reporter, so I'll be extremely busy that week. So in any event, moving on, upcoming events for us. Next month, Tuesday, November 12th, we have Rajiv Shah, who's going to present unified real-time data processing architecture pattern for multi-dimensional data problems. So that's right here, same bat time, same bat channel. And then in December, we have Amol Gote, who's going to present digital signatures decoded, crafting an in-house e-signing microservice. And then in January, Scott Selikoff, who's not here tonight. Oh, you have to yell at him for that. You know, he and Gene Boyarsky are involved in writing books on the certification process for the JDK. So he's this is going to be Scott, who's going to present Certified Java, everything you ever wanted to know about new features in Java 21 and were afraid to ask. So, and then so we have a few things cooking for speakers beyond January. So stay tuned for that, of course. All right, the Friends of GS Jug, the Kansas City Jug on Thursday the 17th. I didn't put the, oh, it's their annual community lightning talks. And then the Atlanta Jug will have Glenn Renfro there, who's going to present Spring Modulith, What the What. Spring Modulith is a relatively new project in this in the Spring ecosystem. And then, oh, I have to refresh that. Ah, there we go. So I almost forgot to, Scott's going to present at the Philly Jug tomorrow. Same presentation. And so, you know, same, but at Philly. And then Billy Carando, as you know, who was here earlier this year, is going to, I think he's presenting the same talk he presented here. It's about the JDK flight recorder. And that is on October 10th up in Boston. And that is it. So if there's anything else, have a good rest of October. We'll see you in November. And have a beer.